Hello viewers. If you've ever prayed, and if you're interested in the physical mechanics of our world, then you've probably wondered how the material and divine interact during an experience like prayer, not just what it feels like, but on an objective, observable level. That's what I'd like to talk about today. Specifically, I'd like to review some of the arguments atheists and materialists have used to argue from science that prayer must be an illusion. At least according to them, it's an argument from science. I would like to illustrate why I think science does not disprove prayer. To begin with, let's be clear about what these atheists actually argue when they try and debunk prayer. I want to avoid straw manning here, so I'll try and present their argument in the strongest possible terms and bring up potential responses and why I think they fail. Atheists often argue that prayer must be an illusion because there is no scientifically supported theory of how an immaterial entity, i.e. a god, can engage in a meaningful exchange of information with a human being. That's one way they argue. Sometimes they make a stronger claim and say that not only is there no scientific theory of prayer, but also that the very idea of human-divine contact is inconceivable. That is to say, it's logically nonsensical. From now on, I will refer to the first argument as the small claim, and the second one as the big claim. I would like to begin by talking about the idea of emergence. There are two kinds of emergence, strong emergence and weak emergence. Weak emergence is central to modern science, and it is not a physical phenomenon, but rather a certain property of physical systems and the equations which describe them. Take a look at this string. Well, actually it's an old shoelace, but the same idea. Now imagine you're trying to build a pulley system, and you need to know exactly how far the string will extend under a certain amount of weight, and crucially, if and when it will snap. Now the string is made up of particles, which are described by the laws of quantum mechanics, which are extremely complicated and require years of intensive study to understand properly. You've got two choices here. You could go and get a master's degree in physics. After all, if you want a mathematical relationship between the weight applied to the string and the length it stretches by, surely you need to understand what's going on at the smallest scale and build up from there. I mean, your other option is to simply guess at a numerical relationship using trial and error, but that doesn't sound very scientific. I think it's time we acknowledge the absurdity here. You can probably guess that the behavior of strings was discovered long before quantum mechanics. I also don't think you'd be surprised to know that the equations governing strings are far less complicated than quantum mechanics. I mean, we teach strings and springs at secondary school, but most university students only meet quantum mechanics a couple of years into their degree. So what's going on here? The answer is emergence, specifically weak emergence. You may have thought about emergence as complexity coming from simplicity, like the fractal patterns in a snowflake. But emergence just means any behavior which only becomes apparent at large scales compared to its constituents. It's very difficult to infer just from looking at the smaller scales. A string is a perfect example. Take Hooke's law. The force applied to a string is proportional to the extension. There are countless particles in a string, but Hooke's law wasn't derived from solving the equations for each individual one and then building up to the string as a whole. Considering the string is such a complicated object when thought about in these terms, it's remarkable the equation governing it is so simple. I mean, it's literally 3 letters, F equals Kx. This is weak emergence in a nutshell. While you could get a perfectly accurate equation for the behavior of a string by considering each particle individually, the same result can be achieved far more easily by just stripping away the irrelevant details. So if that's weak emergence, what's strong emergence? A strongly emergent phenomenon is one which happens only at large enough scales and is not at all determined by what's going on at the smaller scales. In a strongly emergent phenomenon, causation filters down to small scales as well as filtering up to large scales. Strong emergence is far more controversial than weak emergence, and many scientists don't even think it exists. There is no current scientific theory which uses strong emergence, but it's a perfectly legitimate concept and it's definitely not inconceivable. There is nothing logically iffy about it. To see this, imagine you are not a materialist. That is, you think that there are real, existing objects which cannot be described in terms of matter or energy. What I'm about to say should give the same result whether or not you really are a materialist, but you will need to pretend for a moment that you are not. Because you're not a materialist, you think the mind is separate to the brain, and the subjective experiences and sensations you have are completely indescribable in terms of matter. For example, the color red, as you experience it in your mind, that unmistakable redness, is not reducible to a wavelength of light or the impulses in your brain. It is immaterial. Now think about what you're doing right now. You're thinking about these immaterial things, these subjective experiences. This is not the same as simply having the experiences, rather you are actively thinking about an immaterial object. If you're thinking about something, then and there are neurons firing in your brain, impulses traveling, all that. There's physical stuff going on. Take a step back for a moment and just consider what's happening. An immaterial object, i.e. the subjective experience you are thinking about, has directly affected the physical world, i.e. your thoughts. How on earth has this happened? How can the material world be affected by an immaterial thing, which by definition is entirely separate from matter? This feels very weird, but unless you're a materialist, you recognize it's going on every time you think about your own experience. The crucial thing here is that the mind is not made of particles. The mind has no microscopic scale for weak emergence to even be a thing. But the particles in the material world are being influenced by something. They must be to create a thought. So this is an example of strong emergence. When your neuronal impulses combine to create a thought about your own experience, this is not reducible to the microscale of particles. There is a macro-scale cause, the immaterial experience, bringing about this behavior. Now, you might be a materialist and disagree with everything I've just said because you reject the idea that subjective experiences are immaterial. But most materialists do not claim that the existence of immaterial objects is inconceivable. To most materialists, these immaterial things are unnecessary to explain our observations, but they are not logically incoherent. So if you accept that it is conceivable materialism is false, as I think almost everyone, including materialists, does, then strong emergence is conceivable too. This is what we've just established. You don't have to agree that materialism is false, and you don't have to agree that strong emergence exists, but if you accept that immaterial things are at least conceivable, then you should also accept that strong emergence is too. And I think the materialists would do well to remember that as soon as science completely rules out a possibility, whether that be immaterial objects or strong emergence, it is no longer abiding by the scientific method. So what does this all mean for prayer? Well, first I will address the big claim, that human-divine contact is inconceivable. First of all, it seems reasonable to suppose that the mechanism of prayer is strong emergence. After all, the structure of events in human-divine contact is very similar in form to mental-physical interaction, and if anything, an interaction between two minds feels less bizarre than an interaction between the material and immaterial worlds. So if an atheist accepts that strong emergence is conceivable, then they must also agree that prayer is conceivably real in a literal metaphysical sense. If the atheist who makes the big claim rejects materialism, then there is nothing more to say. Clearly they must accept strong emergence, otherwise they can't account for thinking about subjective experience. It's not just that they can't explain it, it's that they would have to deny that it's possible because it is an example of strong emergence. So the non-materialist atheist is forced to conclude that prayer is conceivable, and the big claim is proved false. But let's be honest, this atheist making the big claim is almost certainly a materialist. They probably think that subjective experience and sensation is completely reducible to matter and energy. I personally think this stance is logically incoherent, but I know better than to try and change their mind. Instead, we will say that their materialism forces them to accept weak emergence as the only way to account for consciousness. I think this is true enough, and if a materialist is challenged on how they can explain consciousness, they will almost always bring up emergence as some kind of silver bullet against all the objections to materialism. Okay then, so the mind is weakly emergent. Why couldn't the divine mind be weakly emergent too? If the materialist has no problem explaining the stupefying complexity and undescribable nature of the human mind as just some form of emergence, then surely they must also have no problem explaining that if a God exists, that God's mind is an emergent phenomenon too. If that's all consciousness is, then why would a God's consciousness be any different? So why should they not also accept that these two emergent minds could interact in a human-divine contact experience, which we call prayer? This seems like a perfectly conceivable materialistic explanation of prayer, and crucially one which is completely compatible with there being a divine mind. It's interesting, I think, how the materialist choice to reduce the mind to matter has only made explaining prayer more simple, because we don't have to worry about any strong emergence business. All in all, even if this atheist is a materialist, they are also forced to conclude that it is at least conceivable that prayer is real, and the big claim is again proved false. So we have established that even to the most die-hard materialistic atheist, it is at least not logically impossible that prayer is a true reality. That is to say, it cannot be dismissed out of hand. But what if the atheist still thinks prayer is impossible because there is no scientific theory which suggests that it is real? Or, in a more sophisticated statement, we have scientific theories to explain the concepts around prayer without postulating some real divine mind which prayer puts people in contact with. In other words, the hypothesis that prayer is real is extravagant. This is the small claim, which is much more modest and trickier to challenge than the big claim. That said, I still think it fails for the following reasons. First of all, The atheist making the small claim needs to give us a reason for preferring his explanation over the hypothesis that prayer is real. Okay, he might say we don't need to conclude that prayer is real because there are psychological, neurological, cultural, all sorts of scientific reasons for why prayer feels the way it does. A lot of ex-Christians, for example, will say that the euphoria they felt during a hymn service wasn't actually a human divine contact, it was just that they liked music. The atheist might then use Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the most likely to be true. Another way they might phrase this is that the scientific explanation is more parsimonious. It needs to assume less to be effective. For example, it doesn't need to posit the existence of a divine mind, whereas the hypothesis that prayer is real does. To give the atheist some credit, there is definitely a sense in which the cultural or psychological explanations for prayer are simpler. But here's the thing. Occam's razor and parsimony considerations are not as clear-cut as the atheist would like to present them. Imagine you are a medieval monk who happens to be interested in the movements of the stars. Your hypothesis, which you claim is the simplest of them all, and therefore the most likely to be correct, is that God set up the stars as they are today at the beginning of creation, and made the Earth the center of the solar system because that's where man lives. Now imagine a time traveler from the 21st century suddenly appears in the monastery and tells you that actually the movements of the stars are ellipses, not circles, and that the sun is the center of the solar system, not the Earth, and that actually orbits change over time, and actually the moon used to be part of the Earth, but it was struck off by an asteroid impact, and actually the Earth is boiling hot inside, and actually there's an enormous black hole at the center of our galaxy which sucks things in. You would think he was a crazed, delusional idiot, and I would argue rightly so. I mean, just think of the parsimony considerations. Given the numerical data they had at the time, that is to say, quite little, Occam's razor clearly favours the monk's explanation over the time traveller's, even though we know now that the time traveller's explanation is comparatively truer. What this means for the small claim is that the atheist cannot rule out the hypothesis that prayer is real without being dogmatic. If they abided by the scientific method, they would recognise the limits of Occam's razor and reject the parsimony considerations as speculative. It's also worth noting that almost all the numerical data on prayer and experiences of human divine contact we have been gathered by materialists working on the assumption that prayer should be studied as a cultural or neurological phenomenon, rather than as a real experience. What this means is that whenever quantitative data is brought up in the prayer debate, it always unfairly favours the atheist perspective because the paradigm currently is materialist and secular. It's true that in ideal conditions, raw data itself has no bias or preconceptions, and that these mainly creep in during the interpretation phase of research. But we do not live in ideal conditions. What was a very good idea, that science should be neutral as regards religious matters, has mutated into something much more biased, the assumption that science should be totally materialist and totally secular. Not just neutral, but skeptical. This approach to science immediately rules out any potentially non-materialist explanation as unscientific, and a view being labelled as unscientific is a very stigmatizing thing. So of course the atheist will bring up sociological or psychological perspectives on prayer, because these disciplines are heavily secularized. For example, the founder of sociology, Auguste Comte, whose ideas still form the basis of the discipline, was a humanist, that is to say a radical atheist, who thought that science should not be neutral towards religious affairs, but should actively strip away what he saw as theological baggage. It didn't occur to him that this was an extremely biased conception of science. Ultimately, this total secularization of science means that raw data are interpreted from the materialist atheist framework, and any deviation from this is ostracized as unscientific. So while science itself allows for explanation in terms of psychology or in terms of strong emergence, modern scientists exclusively consider the first, because the second does not fit their paradigm. So ultimately, the small claim is just as flimsy as the big claim, because it relies on a conception of science which already presupposes the atheist's conclusion. For the small claim to work, science needs to completely exclude anything outside of the materialist paradigm. This is not, in my opinion, how science should work. All in all, while the arguments I have given do not prove the reality of prayer, and probably will not convince an atheist to start praying, I think they show that the literal reality of prayer is not at odds with science at all. I've put some sources in the description if you're interested. Goodbye for now, viewers.